I never thought the sound of a paper slapping against a glass desk could hurt more than a wrench dropping on my foot. But it did. My son stood in my office that Tuesday afternoon, 30 years old and dressed in a suit that probably cost more than I made in my first year running this shop. He looked at me like I was something he'd scraped off his Italian leather shoe. Brandon had always been my pride. Smart kid, got into an Ivy League school, made something of himself, or so I thought. He pushed a document across my desk and told me the family name embarrassed him. Miller, the name his grandfather brought from Poland, the name I'd built a reputation on for 40 years, the name that paid for every privilege Brandon ever enjoyed. He wanted to erase it, replace it with something that sounded like it belonged to country club people. St. James. He'd already filed the paperwork, he said, wanted me to transfer the business assets into a new holding company under his fancy new identity. I'm 72 years old. I've rebuilt engines, survived the death of my wife Sarah 5 years ago, and kept this business alive through 3 recessions. But nothing prepared me for the moment your own child looks you in the eye and tells you everything you or isn't good enough for the life he wants. He mentioned his fiancée, Courtney, old money family, important connections. Said she didn't want their future children carrying the stigma of being a mechanic's grandkids. Stigma! That word hung in the air like exhaust fumes. I told him to get out of my office. He straightened his jacket and gave me an ultimatum. Their engagement party was Saturday at the Grand Hotel. I should bring the signed papers. If I didn't, I could forget I had a son or grandchildren. Then he left, and I sat alone in that office, staring at my hands. They were stained with 40 years of honest work. They were the hands that had held him as a baby, taught him to ride a bike, and signed every tuition check. They were also the hands that were about to teach him what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. The garage floor felt like the only honest place left in the world that night. I walked down from my office into the shop after Brandon left, needing to be around something real. The pneumatic tools, the smell of motor oil, the clang of metal on metal. This was the cathedral where I'd spent most of my adult life. Leo was under a Ford F-150, covered in grease up to his elbows. He was maybe 31, Brandon's age, but you'd never know they came from the same generation. Leo slid out from under the truck when he heard me approach, his face lighting up despite the exhaustion. He'd found the transmission problem and fixed it. He talked about that truck like it was a wounded soldier he'd just saved. His kid had been by the shop the week before, maybe 8 years old, watching his dad work with the kind of awe that makes a man stand taller. That boy looked at Leo like he was a superhero, not embarrassed by the grease stains, but proud of them. I remembered Brandon at that age. He'd loved coming to the shop too back then, before college, before Courtney, before he decided his roots were something to be ashamed of. I drove home that night, past the old neighborhood where I'd grown up. My father had been an immigrant, worked in a steel mill, broke his back so I could have a better life. He'd changed our complicated Polish surname to Miller because he wanted us to fit in, to be American, but he never forgot where we came from. He made me promise that the name would mean something, that it would stand for hard work and integrity. When I started the auto shop in 1983, with nothing but a toolbox and a dream, I named it Miller Auto Works. Not because it sounded fancy, but because it was a promise. Every car we fixed, Every customer we treated fairly, every employee we paid on time, it all added weight to that name. It meant something in this neighborhood. Brandon grew up watching me build that. He saw the 70-hour weeks, the missed birthday parties, the stress that probably contributed to his mother's heart condition. Sarah and I sacrificed so he could have opportunities we never did. He went to Northwestern. He never had to work a summer job because I wanted him to focus on his studies. He graduated debt-free because every wrench I turned paid for another credit hour. And now he wanted to pretend none of it existed. I pulled into my driveway and sat in my truck for a long time. The house felt too big since Sarah died. Sometimes I walked past her craft room and still expected to find her there, working on one of her quilts, humming along to old country songs. She loved Brandon fiercely, defended his choices even when I questioned them. What would she think now? Would she tell me to let it go, to just sign the papers and keep the peace? Or would she see what I saw, that this wasn't about a name change, it was about something deeper, something rotten? I went to my study and pulled out an old metal filing cabinet I hadn't opened in years. Inside was the original trust document my father had insisted we create when the business started to really take off in the late 80s. He was paranoid about protecting the family legacy, probably because he'd lost everything once before when he came to America. I'd been so young then, barely understanding half of what the lawyers were talking about. But my father had been crystal clear about one thing. The trust had a clause, a specific provision that seemed old-fashioned even then, something about bloodline and the family name. I never really thought about it, never imagined I'd need it. I pulled out the yellow document and started reading. The legal language was dense, but as I got to Clause 4, my heart started beating faster. My father had been more cunning than I'd given him credit for. The trust stipulated that only a legal miller could inherit. Any voluntary change of surname would void all rights immediately. Brandon, in his arrogance, in his rush to become someone he thought was better, hadn't done his homework. He demanded I transfer assets he assumed were mine to give. But they weren't. They were locked in a trust designed specifically to prevent exactly what he was trying to do. I sat back in my chair, and for the first time since Tuesday, I felt something other than grief. I felt something cold and purposeful settle in my chest. My son thought he could rewrite history, erase his foundation, and still claim the empire built on the name he rejected. He was about to learn that some foundations can't be stripped away without the whole structure collapsing. Thursday morning, I called Howard Henderson. He'd been my lawyer since 1984, older than me by 5 years, sharp as ever, despite the white hair and the reading glasses that seemed to slide down his nose every few minutes. His office smelled like old books and coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. I brought the trust document with me. Howard took one look at it and let out a low whistle. He remembered my father, remembered the old man's insistence on that particular clause. At the time, Howard had thought it was excessive, the kind of thing that would never actually matter. Family law didn't usually work like that anymore, but my father had been adamant, and Howard had done what the client wanted. Howard read through the document slowly, making notes on a legal pad with handwriting that looked like spider tracks. When he got to Clause 4, he stopped and looked up at me over those reading glasses. He asked if I knew what this meant, if I understood what I was about to do. I told him I understood perfectly. My son had legally changed his name to St. James. The trust was ironclad. Brandon had effectively resigned from the family business the moment that name change became official. Howard pushed his glasses up and leaned back in his chair. He asked about Brandon, about whether I'd talked to him, whether he knew about this clause. I shook my head. Brandon had been too busy being embarrassed by me to ever bother learning the legal structure of the business he wanted to inherit. Then Howard asked the question that mattered. The trust required a Miller heir. With Brandon out of the picture, who would inherit? I thought about this for 2 days straight, barely slept. Sarah's absence felt heavier than ever because she would have known what to say, how to navigate this. But she wasn't here, and I had to make this decision alone. The trust had a provision for a substitute beneficiary. It had been left blank for years. We'd always assumed Brandon would be the heir, and after him his children, but Clause 7 allowed me to name a substitute if the primary beneficiary became ineligible for any reason. I told Howard about Leo, about his work ethic, his loyalty, his love for the business, about how he'd stayed late during the 2008 recession when I couldn't afford to pay overtime, but couldn't afford to fall behind on work either, about how he'd loaned me money from his own savings when the bank threatened to foreclose, about how his son looked at him with pride, not shame. Howard was quiet for a long time. Then he asked if I was sure, if I really wanted to cut my own blood out and replace him with an employee, no matter how good that employee was. I thought about Brandon's face when he'd called me an embarrassment. I thought about him saying my grandchildren, children who didn't even exist yet, shouldn't have to carry the burden of being associated with me. I thought about how he'd demanded I use the service entrance at his engagement party, told me to scrub my hands with bleach so I wouldn't soil his image. I told Howard I'd never been more sure of anything in my life. We spent the next 2 hours going through the paperwork. Howard explained that the transfer would be immediate and irrevocable once executed. Brandon would have no legal recourse. The trust was airtight. My father, paranoid immigrant that he was, had made certain of that. The business, the property, the assets, all of it would transfer to Leo Kowalski. Not immediately, Howard clarified. I could retain control during my lifetime if I wanted, but upon my death, or upon my choosing, everything would go to Leo. I told him I wanted it to happen Saturday. At the engagement party, Howard looked at me like I'd lost my mind. He said it would be cruel, public, devastating. It would humiliate Brandon in front of everyone he was trying to impress. I asked him if it was cruel when Brandon told me not to embarrass him. If it was cruel when he said his fiancée's family needed to believe he came from better stock than a mechanic's son. If it was cruel when he threatened to keep my grandchildren from me unless I signed away everything I'd built. Howard didn't answer. He just started preparing the documents. By Thursday evening, everything was ready. The amended trust, the transfer papers, all of it legal and binding. Howard would attend the party on Saturday as my guest. He'd bring the documents. We'd make it official in front of God and everybody. I drove home through rush hour traffic, my hands steady on the wheel. I should have felt guilty. I should have felt like a monster for what I was about to do to my own son. But all I felt was a strange sense of peace. Sometimes love means protecting what you've built from the people who would destroy it. Sometimes being a good father means teaching the hardest lessons, even when it breaks your heart to do it. Saturday was coming. Brandon would get his big party, his moment in the spotlight with his fancy new name and his old money fiancée, and then he'd learn what it really cost to throw away your inheritance. Saturday arrived with unseasonably warm weather for October in Chicago. I spent the morning at the shop, even though we were closed. Leo was there too, doing inventory, making sure everything was organized for Monday. He didn't know what was coming. I hadn't told him, couldn't tell him, not yet. He asked if I was okay, said I'd seemed distracted all week. I told him I had some family business to handle, nothing for him to worry about. He accepted that and went back to work, humming something under his breath, content in a way I envied. I went home and put on my best suit. It was 10 years old, bought for Sarah's funeral. The shoulders were a little tight now, and the style was probably dated, but it was clean and pressed. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw exactly what Brandon saw. An old man with calloused hands and grease permanently etched into the creases of his palms, no matter how much he scrubbed. But I also saw something Brandon didn't. I saw a man who'd built something from nothing, a man who'd employed dozens of people over the years, fed their families, paid for their kids' school supplies during slow months. I saw a man who'd been faithful to his wife until the day she died, who'd never cheated a customer, who'd never cut corners even when money was tight. That man was worth something, whether Brandon St. James thought so or not. The Grand Hotel was exactly what you'd expect from old Chicago money. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, doormen in uniforms that probably cost more than my suit. I pulled up in my Ford F-250, the same truck I'd been driving for 15 years, and watched as a valet in a red jacket looked at it like I'd brought a garbage truck to a wedding. Brandon had been clear about my instructions. I was to park in the back lot, use the service entrance through the kitchen, stay in the shadows, and for the love of God, not interact with any of Courtney's family unless absolutely necessary. I'd memorized every word of those instructions. They'd been delivered via text message, not even a phone call. Just a cold, clinical list of rules for how a father should hide his existence so his son could play pretend. I parked in the back lot as instructed. Howard Henderson was waiting for me near the service entrance, briefcase in hand. He asked one more time if I was certain. I nodded. We went through the kitchen together, past line cooks and servers too busy to notice us. The service hallway led to the main ballroom. I could hear music, laughter, the clink of champagne glasses. Through a partially open door, I caught a glimpse of the party. It was everything Brandon had wanted. Elegant, sophisticated, not a trace of motor oil or manual labor anywhere in sight. Courtney was holding court near the front, her dress probably worth more than a new transmission. She was beautiful in that cold, polished way, like a department store mannequin. Her parents stood nearby, smiling the kind of smiles that never reached the eyes. Brandon was on a small stage they'd set up, microphone in hand, working the room like he'd been born to it. He talked about new beginnings, about the St. James name, about partnership with Courtney's family ventures. He referenced some business deal I knew nothing about, some investment opportunity that required the right pedigree. Then he mentioned the transfer of assets, how tonight was about more than a marriage, it was about building an empire. He gestured toward some papers on a table near the stage. said something about making it official, about his father finalizing the transition. That's when I understood. This wasn't just about the name. Brandon had already made promises based on assets he didn't own. He'd leveraged my business, my reputation, my 40 years of work as collateral for his entry into Courtney's world. He'd sold the farm before he owned it. I stayed in the shadows, watching. Brandon kept glancing toward the service entrance, checking to see if I'd arrived with the signed papers. His smile would flicker slightly each time he looked, a tiny crack in the confident facade. Howard touched my elbow and nodded toward the back of the room. Leo had just walked in through the main entrance, completely out of place in a rented suit that pulled across his shoulders. His wife Rosa was with him, and their son Danny. They'd received an invitation. Brandon's assistant had sent it earlier in the week. A gesture that was supposed to look generous, the boss inviting the help to witness his ascension. Brandon had no idea what he'd done. He'd invited the one person I trusted most in the world to watch his own execution. Leo saw me and started to make his way over, confused about why I was standing in the service hallway instead of seated with the guests. But I held up a hand, stopped him. Not yet. Soon, but not yet. Brandon was wrapping up his speech, saying something about family legacy and honoring tradition while building the future. The irony was so thick, I could taste it. He looked directly at me then, or rather, at the shadow where I stood, and his expression tightened. He needed those papers. His whole performance depended on them. I stepped out of the shadows and walked toward the stage. The room didn't notice me at first. I was just another old man in an outdated suit. But Brandon noticed. His eyes locked on mine, searching for the leather folder that should have contained the signed transfer documents. I wasn't carrying anything except Howard's business card in my pocket. Brandon's smile faltered completely. He wrapped up his speech quickly, awkwardly, and stepped down from the stage to intercept me. He spoke in a harsh whisper, demanding to know where the papers were. Told me I was embarrassing him, that I was supposed to sign and leave, not make a scene. I told him we needed to talk, all of us together. Public setting, transparent. He looked at me like I'd pulled a gun. Courtney was approaching now, her perfect smile frozen in place, sensing something was wrong. Her father followed, a silver-haired man with the kind of face that's never known real hardship. Brandon insisted there was nothing to discuss. The deal was simple. I sign, he inherits, everybody moves forward. That's when I called Howard over and asked him to explain Clause 4. Howard Henderson had been practicing law for over 40 years, and his courtroom voice could still cut through a crowded room like a knife. When he spoke, people listened. He introduced himself to Brandon, to Courtney, to her father. Professional, courteous, unflappable. He explained that he'd been the Miller family attorney since 1984, that he'd structured the business trust under my father's specific instructions, and that there were certain provisions Brandon seemed unaware of. Brandon's face went from confused to irritated. He said whatever provisions existed, they didn't matter. He was my son, the sole heir, and it was time for the transition to happen. He glanced at Courtney's father, clearly worried about how this looked. Howard opened his briefcase and pulled out the trust document. He didn't hand it to Brandon. Instead, he began reading aloud, his voice carrying in that authoritative way lawyers have. He read the preamble, the standard language about asset protection and succession planning. Brandon tried to interrupt several times, but Howard just kept reading. Then he got to Clause 4. The clause stated, in clear legal language, that the trust beneficiary must maintain the Miller surname, both legally and socially, as a condition of inheritance. Any voluntary change, renunciation, or rejection of the surname would result in immediate disqualification and the activation of substitute beneficiary provisions. The room got very quiet. Courtney's father, who'd been checking his phone, looked up sharply. Courtney herself went pale under her makeup. Brandon stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. He tried to laugh it off. Said it was an old document, probably invalid. Said names didn't matter. It was archaic thinking. Said I was his father and I could override any clause I wanted. Howard explained patiently that the trust was irrevocable. I'd signed away my right to modify its core provisions in 1985 in exchange for significant tax advantages. The trust owned the business, the property, the equipment, everything. I was the trustee, but not the owner. The trust's rules govern succession, not my personal wishes. Brandon turned to me then, his face shifting from confusion to something darker. He said this was a trap, that I'd known about this clause all along and let him change his name just to spite him, that I was a bitter old man who couldn't stand to see his son succeed. I let him finish, let him get it all out. Then I spoke for the first time since Howard started reading. I told him I hadn't known he was going to change his name. I'd never imagined my own son would be so ashamed of where he came from that he'd erase his entire identity. The clause had been his grandfather's idea, a man who'd lost everything once and wanted to make sure the family name meant something, stood for something, couldn't be discarded when it became inconvenient. Courtney found her voice then. She asked what this meant exactly. What happened now? Howard explained that according to Clause 7, the trust authorized me to name a substitute beneficiary if the primary heir became ineligible. The substitution would be immediate and irrevocable upon execution. Brandon's face went from angry to terrified in the space of a heartbeat. He asked if I'd already named someone, if I'd already taken everything away from him. I didn't answer directly. Instead, I told him about the text message he'd sent, about being told to use the service entrance, about the instruction to wash my hands with bleach, about being told his future children shouldn't carry the stigma of having me as a grandfather. Courtney's father interjected then, his voice sharp. He said this was clearly some kind of scam, that I was probably senile and being manipulated. He suggested Howard was running a con, exploiting an old man's confusion. Howard, God bless him, didn't even blink. He offered to provide contact information for 3 independent attorneys who could verify the trust's validity. He offered to wait while they called their own lawyers to review the documents. He suggested they might want to do that before making accusations they couldn't back up. The man shut up immediately. Brandon tried a different approach. He said he'd change his name back, file the paperwork Monday morning, become Brandon Miller again. Said it was all a mistake, that Courtney's family had pressured him, that he'd been trying to fit in and made a bad choice. Howard explained that the clause was triggered by voluntary action. Brandon had chosen to change his name. The trust didn't include provisions for reversal or second chances. Once triggered, the disqualification was permanent. Brandon looked at me with something I'd never seen before, desperation, real, raw desperation. He said I couldn't do this, that I was his father, that family didn't throw each other away over names and pride. And that's when I realized he still didn't understand. He thought this was about the name, about ego, about revenge. It wasn't. I told him about Leo, about how he'd saved the business during the recession when the banks wouldn't lend and customers couldn't pay, about how he'd worked Christmas Eve when his wife was in labor because we had a fleet deadline, about how he'd never once asked for more than he earned, never demanded what he hadn't worked for, never looked down on the work that fed his family. I told him about Leo's son, Danny, who came to the shop after school and watched his father work with pride, who wanted to be a mechanic when he grew up because his dad was his hero. I told Brandon that's what the Miller name meant, not sophistication or social climbing, not erasing your past to impress people who'd never respect you anyway. It meant honoring the work, respecting the people who depend on you, and understanding that real wealth isn't in a fancy name or a big house. It's in being able to look at yourself in the mirror and recognize the person looking back. Brandon had thrown that away, not when he changed his name, but long before. Maybe in college, when he stopped coming to the shop. Maybe when he started dating Courtney and realized her world had no room for motor oil and blue-collar roots. Maybe when his mother died and he couldn't be bothered to stick around for more than 2 days because he had important networking events. The name change was just the final symptom of a disease that had been growing for years. I turned to where Leo was standing at the back of the room, confused and concerned. I called him forward. It was time to finish this. Leo walked toward the stage area with the kind of uncertainty that comes from being completely out of your element. His rented suit pulled across his shoulders with every step. His wife Rosa followed a few paces behind, holding Danny's hand tight. The boy looked scared, sensing something big was happening, but not understanding what. Brandon was still trying to process what I'd said about Leo. He looked at the man approaching, and I could see his mind working, trying to find an angle, a way out. He asked what Leo had to do with any of this. I told him everything. Howard pulled out the amended trust document, the one we'd prepared on Thursday. He explained that Clause 7 allowed me, as trustee, to designate a substitute beneficiary in the event the primary heir became ineligible. The substitution could be any person I deemed worthy of carrying on the Miller legacy. Leo reached us and asked what was going on. He looked at me, then at Brandon, then at the papers Howard was holding. His face was a mixture of confusion and growing dread, like he knew he was standing in the middle of something that was about to explode. I told him the truth, told him about Brandon's name change, about the trust clause, about the disqualification, told him that I'd watched him for 15 years, seen his work ethic, his integrity, his love for the business that went beyond a paycheck, told him that he embodied everything the Miller name was supposed to represent. Then I told him I was naming him as the substitute beneficiary of the trust. Leo's face went white. He said I couldn't be serious, that it was too much, that he was just a mechanic, that he didn't know anything about running a business, that Brandon was my son and family came first. Rosa started crying. Not sad tears, but shocked ones, overwhelmed ones. She'd worked as a waitress for 20 years to help support their family while Leo built his career at the shop. The weight of what I was offering was crushing them both. Brandon found his voice again. He said I was insane, that you couldn't just give a multi-million-dollar business to an employee, that Leo had no training, no education, no right to something that belonged to family. I asked him what family meant. If it was blood, regardless of character. If it was sharing DNA, even when you shared nothing else. Or if family was the people who showed up, who stood by you, who valued what you built together. Courtney's father stepped in then, trying to sound reasonable. He suggested we all calm down, take a breath, discuss this privately. He said decisions made in anger were rarely good decisions. He implied I was being emotional and irrational. Howard shut that down immediately. He explained that I'd made this decision days ago, that the paperwork had been prepared by multiple attorneys, that every contingency had been considered. This wasn't a rash choice made in the heat of the moment. This was a carefully planned transfer based on sound legal grounds and clear trust provisions. Then Howard did something that made Brandon's face go from angry to ashen. He pulled out additional documents, financial statements, property deeds, corporate registration papers. He explained that the business owned more than just the shop and the equipment. Over the 40 years since the trust was established, assets had been acquired and placed under the corporate umbrella. The building where we operated, the commercial property we rented to other businesses, 3 residential properties that generated rental income, investment accounts that had been funded with profits during good years. Brandon had known the business was successful, but he'd never bothered to learn the details. He'd assumed it was a blue-collar shop that did okay. He had no idea my father's paranoia about asset protection had led to a structure that sheltered and grew wealth steadily over decades. The total value, Howard stated clearly for everyone to hear, was somewhere in the neighborhood of $8 million. Courtney made us sound like she'd been punched. Her father's reasonable demeanor cracked. Brandon actually stumbled backward, catching himself on a chair. $8 million! Not a fortune by Courtney's family standards, but substantial. More than enough to make Brandon's claims of being a self-made success look like the lie they were. More than enough to make his betrayal cut deeper. He'd traded all of that for a name that sounded good at cocktail parties. Leo was shaking his head, backing away. He said he couldn't accept it, that it wasn't right, that I'd built this for my family and he wasn't my family. I walked over to him and put my hand on his shoulder. I told him about the Christmas when the bank tried to call my loans during the recession, how Leo had emptied his savings account and loaned me $30,000. No questions asked, no contract, just trust. I'd paid him back with interest, but the gesture had meant everything. I told him about the time a customer tried to sue us over work we'd done perfectly, claiming damages that never happened, trying to shake us down. Leo had spent his days off documenting everything, gathering evidence, testifying in court without being asked. We'd won that case because of him. I told him about the afternoon Sarah collapsed in the shop office and Leo had performed CPR while we waited for the ambulance. She died 3 days later in the hospital, but she'd been conscious long enough to say goodbye because Leo had kept her heart beating those crucial minutes. I told him he'd already paid for this inheritance with 15 years of loyalty, integrity, and love for something bigger than himself. That's when Leo started crying. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears running down his face while he tried to maintain his composure. Rosa was openly sobbing now, holding Danny close. Brandon saw his last chance slipping away. He tried to appeal to Leo directly, said Leo was a good man and wouldn't want to be part of destroying a family, said this wasn't what Sarah would have wanted, said Leo should refuse the inheritance and encourage me to reconcile with my son. Leo looked at Brandon for a long moment. Then he asked Brandon a simple question. He asked if Brandon remembered the Christmas party 5 years ago, right before Sarah got sick. The party where all the employees and their families came to the shop for dinner. Leo wanted to know if Brandon remembered Danny, who'd been so excited to meet the boss's son, who'd wanted to show Brandon the toy car he'd gotten for his birthday. Brandon didn't remember. His face made that clear. Leo said Danny had been talking about that moment for weeks leading up to the party. The boy had been so excited to meet Brandon because his dad talked about the boss's son sometimes, about how smart he was. But when Danny had approached Brandon that night, Brandon had been on his phone, working some business deal. He'd brushed the kid off without even looking at him. Danny had been crushed, had asked his dad why Brandon didn't want to meet him. Leo had made excuses, said Brandon was busy, important people had important things to do. But Leo had seen the truth. Brandon hadn't brushed his son off because he was busy. He'd done it because Danny was just a mechanic's kid, and mechanic's kids weren't worth Brandon's time. Leo told Brandon he'd accept the inheritance, not because he wanted to hurt Brandon, but because he'd seen years ago who Brandon really was, and that person didn't deserve what I'd built. Howard laid the papers out on a table near the stage, transferred documents, updated trust certificates, property deeds, bank authorizations, everything legally required to move forward with the substitution. He explained the process calmly, like he was reading a grocery list. I would sign first as trustee, executing my authority to name a substitute beneficiary. Then Leo would sign, accepting the terms and responsibilities. Then 3 witnesses would sign, validating the transfer. Brandon was making sounds like a wounded animal. Courtney was trying to hold it together but failing. Her father had gone stone-faced, the way powerful men do when they realize they've miscalculated badly. Some of Courtney's relatives had gathered closer, drawn by the commotion. They were witnessing exactly the kind of scene they'd probably spent their lives avoiding: raw emotion, public confrontation, the ugly truth that money and status can't insulate you from consequences. Brandon tried one more time. He said he'd take me to court, that he'd fight this, that no judge would allow a father to cut out his biological son in favor of a stranger. Howard didn't even look up from arranging the papers. He stated that the trust was reviewed by 3 separate legal firms in the past week. All confirmed its validity. All confirmed that the discretionary authority granted to me as trustee was absolute within the parameters set forth in the original document. Brandon could file any lawsuit he wanted. He'd lose, waste money on lawyers, and end up in the same place. Then Howard mentioned something I hadn't known he'd done. He'd taken the precaution of filing the amended trust documents with the county clerk's office that morning. The transfer was already in the public record. Even if I died in the next 5 minutes, the change would stand. He'd protected me from any last-minute disaster, from Brandon trying something desperate, from accidents or sudden illness. The old lawyer had seen his share of family warfare over the years. He knew how ugly it could get. I picked up the pen Howard offered. My hand was steady. I thought I might feel something in this moment: regret, doubt. the weight of what I was doing to my own blood, but all I felt was resolve. This was right. Not easy, not painless, but right. I signed my name in 6 different places. Hank Miller. The same signature I'd been using for 72 years. Each stroke of the pen was a nail in the coffin of Brandon's ambitions. Leo was still hesitating. I could see the war happening inside him. The man was decent to his core. Taking something that belonged to someone else, even someone like Brandon, went against everything he believed. I told him this wasn't about taking. It was about accepting a burden, because running the business wasn't going to be easy. He'd be responsible for 23 employees and their families. He'd have to make payroll every 2 weeks. He'd have to handle difficult customers, equipment breakdowns, economic downturns. He'd have to sacrifice time with his family, work weekends, make hard choices. This wasn't a prize. It was a responsibility. And I needed someone who understood that. Leo looked at Rosa. She nodded through her tears. He looked at Danny, who was staring up at him with wide, confused eyes. Then he picked up the pen. Brandon lunged forward, trying to grab the papers. Howard was faster than you'd expect for a man in his 70s. He swept the documents away and stood between Brandon and the table, his face a mask of professional neutrality that somehow conveyed a clear message. Try it and see what happens. 2 of the hotel's security staff had appeared at some point. They positioned themselves nearby, not intervening, but ready. Someone must have called them when things started getting heated. Leo signed. His signature was shaky, uncertain, nothing like my firm strokes. But it was there, legal, binding. Howard called for the witnesses. He'd brought 2 associates from his firm. They signed quickly, professionally. Then he asked for a 3rd witness from the party, someone unconnected to either side who could testify they'd observed the signing of sound mind and free will. Courtney's father volunteered, not because he wanted to help, but because he needed to verify this was real, needed to see with his own eyes that the deal he'd thought his daughter was making, the alliance with Brandon St. James and his supposed business empire, was actually an alliance with nothing. He signed his name. Then he looked at Courtney and shook his head slightly. The message was clear. This engagement was over. Courtney understood. She turned to Brandon and asked what else he'd lied about the business, about his assets, about his prospects. She'd been raised in a world where background checks were standard, where families investigated families before allowing marriages. But Brandon had been so smooth, so convincing, and she'd been charmed by the self-made success story he'd spun. Now, she was learning he'd made nothing. He was nothing. Just a man who'd traded his inheritance for a fake name and was left with neither. She pulled the engagement ring off her finger and set it on the table next to the trust documents. She told Brandon she'd have her lawyers contact him about the apartment, the car, any other property that might be in dispute. Then she walked away, her father following, the rest of her family and guests trailing behind like a receding tide. Within 5 minutes, the ballroom was half empty. The party was over. Brandon stood alone near the stage, his St. James suit and his St. James haircut and his St. James dreams all crumbling around him. He looked at me with something I couldn't quite name. Not hatred, not even anger anymore. Loss. Pure, complete loss. He asked me how I could do this, how I could destroy him like this. I told him I hadn't destroyed him. He'd destroyed himself. I just declined to save him from the consequences. Leo and his family were standing off to the side, still in shock. Howard was gathering the documents, preparing to file additional paperwork on Monday. The hotel staff was starting to clean up, removing champagne glasses and uneaten hors d'oeuvres. I walked over to Brandon one last time. I told him the apartment he was living in was corporate property. He'd need to vacate within 30 days. The car was titled to the business. He'd need to return it by Tuesday. His health insurance was through the company plan. That would end in 90 days unless he found new employment. Everything he thought he owned, he'd been borrowing. And now the loan was being called. I told him he could keep his new name, St. James. It suited him. It was exactly as substantial and meaningful as he'd become. Then I left him standing there in the empty ballroom of the Grand Hotel, surrounded by the wreckage of his own choices. Leo followed me out, his family close behind. As we walked through the front entrance this time, not the service door, the evening air hit my face like a blessing. Leo said he didn't know what to say, didn't know how to thank me, didn't know if he could live up to what I'd given him. I told him he already had. 20 years early, every day just by being who he was. We walked to the parking lot together, my old Ford next to his Honda. Working vehicles, honest vehicles, the kind that didn't need to make a statement because they were too busy doing a job. I'd come to this hotel a few hours ago knowing exactly what I was going to do. Now I was leaving, and somehow the weight I'd been carrying for 5 days was gone. I'd lost my son tonight, really lost him in a way I couldn't take back. But I'd saved my soul, and maybe, in the long run, that was the trade I had to make. Monday morning felt different. I got to the shop at 5 a.m. like always, but this time, Leo was already there waiting in the parking lot. He had a notebook, had clearly been up all night writing questions, preparing himself. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. We spent the first hour going through the basics, how the trust worked, what his actual authority was, the difference between being the beneficiary and being the day-to-day operator. I was still the trustee until I chose to step down or couldn't serve anymore, which meant I'd help him transition, teach him the business side he'd never needed to know as a mechanic. By 7 a.m., the rest of the crew started arriving. Word had spread somehow. Small shops are like small towns. Everybody knows everything. The guys didn't know all the details, but they knew something big had happened at Brandon's party. I called a meeting in the shop bay before we opened. All 23 employees, everyone from the senior mechanics to the kid who swept floors after school. I told them the truth, told them about Brandon's name change, about the trust clause, about Leo becoming the new owner. The reaction was mixed. Some of the older guys who'd been around since the beginning understood immediately. A few of the younger ones looked concerned, wondering if this meant changes in pay or job security. But most of them just looked at Leo, and what they saw reassured them. They knew Leo. They trusted him. One of the mechanics, a guy named Rodriguez who'd been with us 12 years, started clapping. Slow at first, then others joined. Within seconds, the whole shop was applauding, and Leo looked like he might pass out from the pressure. I let it go on for a minute, then called for quiet. I told them nothing would change immediately. Same work, same pay, same standards. The only difference was Leo would be learning the office side, and eventually, when I was ready, he'd take over completely. They accepted that, went to work like it was any other Monday. Around 10 a.m., Brandon showed up. He didn't storm in angry this time. He looked diminished somehow. 3 days of reality had aged him. He was wearing jeans and a plain button-down shirt. No suit, no saint. James Armour. He asked to speak with me privately. We went to my office, the same office where this had all started the week before. Brandon said he'd talked to 3 lawyers. All of them told him the same thing Howard had. The trust was solid. The transfer was legal. He had no grounds to contest it. He'd also talked to Courtney's father. That conversation had been short. The man had made it clear that Brandon was no longer welcome in their circles, that the engagement was terminated, and that if Brandon tried to leverage their brief relationship for any business opportunities, there would be legal consequences. Brandon had spent the weekend in a hotel. The apartment locks had been changed Saturday night. Building security had his belongings in storage. He could collect them once he provided a forwarding address. He sat in the chair across from my desk and asked what he was supposed to do now. No job, no home, no prospects. His fancy degree was in business management, and his only real work experience was 3 years at a consulting firm where he'd done well, but burned bridges when he quit abruptly to pursue Courtney's investment opportunities. I didn't gloat, didn't lecture, just listened. He said he understood why I'd done it, said he'd had a lot of time to think over the past 2 days. He'd been ashamed of where he came from, thought he needed to be someone else to matter, and in trying to become that person, he'd lost everything that actually did matter. He asked if there was any way back. If he changed his name again, if he worked to rebuild trust, if he proved himself, could he earn his way back into the family? I told him the trust was irrevocable. Even if I wanted to change it, which I wasn't sure I did, I couldn't. The legal structure prevented it. But I also told him that the business wasn't everything. He was still my son. That didn't change just because the inheritance had. He started crying then. Not the dramatic crying of the engagement party, but quiet, broken crying. He said he'd been a terrible son, had taken everything for granted, had valued the wrong things, had hurt the people who loved him most. He was right. All of it was true. But sitting there, watching him break down, I realized something. I'd made mistakes, too. I'd been so focused on building the business, on providing financially, that I'd maybe missed chances to teach him what really mattered. Sarah had tried. She'd pushed him to spend time in the shop to understand the work, but I'd told her to let him focus on school, on his future. We'd raised him to escape blue-collar life, then acted surprised when he wanted to escape it. I told him he could work here if he wanted, not in the office, not in management, in the bays, turning wrenches, learning the business from the ground up like Leo had. I'd pay him standard mechanic's wages, nothing special. He'd have to prove himself to the crew, earn their respect. It wouldn't lead to ownership. That ship had sailed. But it could lead to understanding, to connection, to being part of something real. Brandon wiped his eyes and asked if I meant it, if I'd really give him that chance. I said yes, but he had to understand the terms. He'd be just another employee. Leo was his boss now. If Leo said do something, Brandon did it. No special treatment, no shortcuts, no trading on the family name. He agreed. Said he'd start Tuesday if that was okay. Said he needed Monday to find an apartment, something cheap, figure out his life. After he left, I sat in my office for a while. Leo came in eventually, asked if everything was okay. I told him about the conversation, about offering Brandon a job. Leo's face was hard to read. He asked if I was sure, if I thought Brandon could really change, if having him around wouldn't cause problems. I admitted I didn't know, but I told Leo it was his decision. He was the owner. If he didn't want Brandon working here, that was his call, and I'd support it. Leo thought for a long time. Then he said yes. Brandon could work here, but he'd be on probation for 6 months. Any problems, any attitude, anything that disrupted the team, and he was gone. That seemed fair. Wednesday, Brandon showed up at 6 a.m. in work boots and jeans. Leo partnered him with Rodriguez, one of the toughest but fairest mechanics we had. Rodriguez would teach him the basics, evaluate his work, report back. I watched from my office window as Brandon struggled with a simple brake job that first day. His hands weren't calloused yet. He dropped tools, got frustrated, but he kept at it. Rodriguez corrected him patiently, showed him again, made him do it right. By the end of the week, Brandon had changed. Not completely, not magically, but something in his eyes was different, humbler, more present. The crew was wary but not hostile. They give him a chance because Leo asked them to. But they'd judge him by his work, not his last name, not Miller, not St. James. Just by what he did with his hands each day, I didn't know if it would last. If Brandon would stick it out or quit when the novelty wore off and the reality of physical labor set in. But he'd taken the first step. That counted for something. Leo was doing better than I'd expected with the business side. He asked good questions, learned fast, brought a common-sense approach to problems I'd been overcomplicating for years. The transition was happening naturally. By the end of that first month, I was coming in at 7 instead of 5, letting Leo handle the opening. Trusting him with decisions I'd been micromanaging for decades, it felt strange, but also right. Like finally setting down a weight I'd been carrying so long, I'd forgotten it was heavy. 6 months passed before I realized I was ready. Ready to step back completely. Ready to let Leo run the business without me looking over his shoulder. Brandon had surprised everyone, maybe especially himself. He showed up every day on time. He worked hard, didn't complain, learned. Rodriguez reported that he'd become a decent mechanic. Not great yet, but solid. More importantly, he'd become someone the crew could count on. The change in him went deeper than I'd hoped. He'd found an apartment in a working-class neighborhood, nothing fancy. Started dating a teacher he'd met at a coffee shop. Simple life, honest life. The kind of life he'd been running from when all this started. He'd changed his name back to Miller, not for the inheritance because he knew that was gone forever, but for himself. Took him 3 months to make the decision, another 2 to file the paperwork. When he told me, he said it wasn't about the business or the family legacy. It was about remembering where he came from, about honoring the sacrifices that had been made for him. He still had a long way to go. Some wounds don't heal fast, but he was walking in the right direction. Leo's transition to full ownership happened on a Tuesday in April. We did the final paperwork in Howard's office. I officially resigned as trustee, naming Leo as my successor in that role too. The business was completely his now. My name was still on the building, but only because Leo insisted on keeping it there. He tried to give me a retirement package, generous severance, continued health benefits, profit sharing. I turned down most of it. took enough to live comfortably, but not extravagantly, kept my truck, kept my house, gave away most of what I didn't need. The crew threw me a retirement party at the shop. Nothing fancy. Pizza, beer, stories. Brandon gave a speech that made everyone uncomfortable at first, talking about failure and redemption. But he pulled it off, made people laugh with stories about his early mistakes in the Bay, thanked them for teaching him. Rodriguez handed me a plaque they'd all signed. Simple wooden thing with brass plate. Hank Miller, the real deal. I hung it in my home office, where I see it every morning. I'd expected retirement to feel empty. Thought I'd be lost without the shop, without the routine, but it didn't work out that way. I started doing things I'd put off for 40 years, took up fishing, drove out to Montana and spent 3 weeks in a cabin by a river. Read books, lots of books. Sarah had always said I'd read more when I had time. She was right. I volunteered at a community college, teaching an evening class on small business management. Most of the students were working adults trying to improve their lives. They reminded me of myself at that age, hungry, hopeful, willing to work. Leo and I still talked regularly. He'd call with questions about tricky situations. Though less often as time went on, he was finding his own way, making the business his. Brandon came by my house sometimes. Sunday dinners became a thing. He'd bring his girlfriend, a woman named Jennifer, who taught 3rd grade and laughed easily. They were talking about marriage. She knew his whole story, all of it, and loved him anyway. He asked me once if I regretted it. The trust, the transfer, everything. If I wished things had gone differently. I thought about it honestly. Told him I regretted that it had been necessary. Regretted that he'd had to hit bottom before finding his way back up. But I didn't regret protecting the business. Didn't regret giving it to someone who valued it for the right reasons. He said he understood. Said he was grateful. In a strange way. That losing everything had saved him from becoming someone he would have hated. We left it at that. A year after my retirement, Leo called me one evening. Said he needed advice about expansion. A competitor's shop was closing, location was good, price was reasonable. He wanted to know if I thought it was a smart move. I told him it was his business now, his decision. I trusted his judgment. He was quiet for a moment. Then he thanked me, not for the advice, but for everything, for the chance, for believing in him, for showing him that loyalty and hard work still meant something. I told him he'd earned every bit of it. After we hung up, I sat on my back porch, watching the sun go down. The same porch where Sarah and I used to sit on summer evenings, talking about the future, making plans. I missed her, would always miss her, but I thought she'd be proud of how things turned out, proud that the business we built together was in good hands, proud that Brandon had found his way back from the edge, proud that Leo's son Danny now talked about taking over the shop someday. The Miller name would survive, not through bloodline, but through something stronger, through character, through work, through understanding that legacy isn't what you pass down to your children, it's what you build that's worth passing down. I'd built something that lasted, not because my name was on a building, but because the values behind that name meant something to people who'd carry them forward. Brandon wasn't getting my money or my business, but he was getting something better. He was getting a second chance, a chance to build his own legacy, one calloused hand at a time. To be the kind of man his children would be proud of, not despite his work, but because of it. Leo was already that man, which was why the business belonged to him. Some people might think I was cruel. That blood should count for more than I gave it credit for. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm just a bitter old man who couldn't forgive his son's mistakes. But sitting there on my porch, watching another day end, I felt at peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you did the hard right thing instead of the easy wrong thing. The Miller legacy was secure. Not in the way I'd planned when I first started that shop 40 years ago with nothing but a toolbox and a dream, but in a better way, a way that honored what my father had taught me, what I'd tried to teach my son, and what the name really meant: hard work, integrity, loyalty, respect for the people who depend on you. Those values don't care about bloodlines or fancy names or social climbing. They exist in the choices we make every day, in the way we treat people, in what we're willing to sacrifice for something bigger than ourselves. I'd pass those values to Leo, and maybe, finally, to Brandon too. That was a legacy worth building, worth protecting, worth everything it cost. The sun finished setting. The sky turned purple, then dark. I stayed on the porch a while longer, content with silence, content with memory, content with the knowledge that when my time came, I could look back on this moment and know I'd made the right choice. The Miller name would live on, not carved in stone or written in legal documents, but in the hearts of people who understood what it really meant, and that was enough. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this story about loyalty, legacy, and the true meaning of family. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let me know if you've ever had to make a tough choice between blood and principles. And if you want more stories about real people facing real consequences, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Thanks for being here.